It's a pleasure to be here with Rabbi Amitai Fraiman, who is the director of the Z3 Project, an initiative of the Oshman family Palo Alto, aiming to foster a healthier relationship between diaspora Jewry and Israel. So thanks for taking some time to talk.
Of course, it's great to be here, Shmuly.
So it'd be great to discuss the developments and changes in your personal experience of the religious Zionist world in Israel over the last few decades. So maybe you can share a little bit about where you came, what world you came from,
Sure.
and how that world looks a little different today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I was born in Jerusalem. The parents who made Aliyah in the 70s, they met in Pardes. So we stayed in that Jerusalem world, that Anglo world for a while. And growing up, when I grew up, we were very much exposed to, obviously, the political changes and some of the security issues that happened during those years, right? It's kind of like a Forrest Gump story. I mean, all Israelis, in a way, are that. You see peace treaties, you see military operations, you see wars. As a kid growing up, that's kind of what defined, very much left an imprint on my identity. And so I ended up going to Yeshiva High School in Efrat, in Gush Etzion. It was Rav Riskin's high school in Shmuly. Very interesting 4 years. It was between the years 2000 and 2004, which is like the height of the Second Intifada. And those memories really ingrained and influenced who I was. And so religiously and politically, you can see in the community I was part of a very specific shift towards a direction that wasn't familiar to me in my home growing up. My parents were members of liberal Zionist movements, and going to the schools that I went to in that specific mode of time really heavily influenced the way I viewed things. And I remember going to demonstrations with school. I remember going to funerals as a school. Very dramatic moment in time, which really, in a generational sense, really left an imprint. And I think that kind of set the tone for what we see today in the political representations of what's called today the Bayit Yehudi. It used to be the Mafdal, which is the Jewish Home Party. Now it's called the Yamina. It kind of went through these multiple changes, trying to encompass and bring together other factions and other parties. But basically, that period in time, I think, was a shift in how the religious Zionist movement saw itself as a community. I think what started then, we see today. I think, first of all, what we see from a political perspective was a sharp move to the right. Right before that, it wasn't so clear. Yes, we have Gush Emunim, but over the years, most of the issues that we cared about as a community were very social-oriented. Education, health, and we kind of promoted those liberal values as a society. And with that, with the height of first and the Second Intifada, and that kind of changed the way the community thought, and personal level also very much ingrained that into me. And today we see the tail end of that process.
Yeah. So would you say, for example, that the progressive religious Zionist world has grown in the last few decades or shrunk?
So it's an interesting question. I think that part of, I don't know if I have the tools to say say yes, this it grew at this percentage or not. What I do know, what I think we can say is that the voting patterns of the religious Zionist community, looking at myself, my friends, we don't vote along our communal lines anymore. If we used to all vote for the same party because we were concerned that with getting the right budgets, we get funding for our schools, for different institutions, for our youth movements. Today, because the religious Zionist community has become more of a spectrum, it's much broader. People moved up in social economic standing. They feel that they could vote along different areas of policy. So we see a fractioning of that. Right? An interesting example is if you look at the rabbis, right, who supported the Jewish home of Bayit Yehudi in 2009, is not in any way similar to the same rabbis who are supporting him today. We see a clear shift.
Like who are some of those people who would have supported them but never would today?
So you see Rav Yehuda Gilad. He's a rabbi in Male Gilboa. He's one of my rabbis. His name is a prominent name on the list in 2009. His name wouldn't be there today. It's not there today. And you see folks who might be, Yehuda Gilad was associated very strongly, affiliated with Neimad. He wouldn't be today feel comfortable at all with Yamina, Bayit Yehudi, whatever permutation of that party is today. Which is an interesting point. I mean, there is tension within the community. Another interesting example that we see of this shift. I mean, it's there's a trend. So they had a couple weeks ago, Ayelet Shaked was going to go speak in synagogues, and then the liberal Facebook universe a lot of people, there was an outcry, like, since when do we bring in politicians in that way into our synagogues and Friday night services, right? And for some churches, of course, that's what we have to do, right? We have to bring them in, we have to vote for them. So I think there's some kind of splintering in the community, for sure.
Okay, so, having lived in Efrat and learned over there for 2 years, I'm quite familiar with the ideology around how central the land is, and even expansion, and the cynicism towards any kind of peace process or anything like this, even a distaste for even talk about it. But what's some of the intellectual underpinnings of kind of younger religious Zionists who are drifting away from that? Those, what are either intellectual or educational or even social influences? Because it makes sense why me living in America, all the influences that upon me as to why I would be drifting from such an ideology. But why would young Israelis drift from that?
That's a great question. I think that so first of all, I think that in the more liberal side of religious Zionism, I think they would the tension that they feel between the land and the people and the family, the nation, right? And do we sacrifice human life for the land? And while they, the religious Zionist rabbis wouldn't say that the land of Israel isn't holy or less holy, and that therefore they're willing to give it up, they would say we are more careful with human life, and therefore we need to figure out a way around the situation and solve it and move towards peace, right? Both the lives of Israelis and those of the Palestinians, because the value of human life. And so I think the younger generation would buy into that. I think in general that's in line with many of just the progressive ideals and ideas that we see in the marketplace. That's number one. Number two, I think that people just want, they're tired. There's fatigue, they want normalcy, and they understand that, that there's, so it's interesting because I don't know if there's still a cynicism. I think in general in Israel there's a cynicism towards a peace process. There is a shrinkage of the left in Israel in a way. Like the largest party that's fighting for the title against Bibi Netanyahu is not a left-wing party by any measure, right? You have people there who are on the right of Likud. Yoaz Hindel is an example. Tzvi Hauser, wonderful, very idealistic people, but they are not left by any measure. And I think that in general folks are kind of like are exhausted and want to focus on other things, which are social issues, tensions of church and state.
Right. Okay, so before we get to your work, let's identify the problem. Some of the drift or rift from Israeli Jews and diaspora Jews, but in this case let's talk about American Jews, since it's the largest chunk of the diaspora, of course. And what do you see happening over the last 2 or 3 years, or even the last 10 to 20 years, that is causing some of this problem? And we'll talk, in our next stage will be, what can we do about that? What are you doing about that? But what do you think are some of the main factors that are leading to a divide, that there's not really a central mission or vision, or even some tension?
Many wiser and smarter people have discussed this topic before me. I think my own intuition, right? I've always been half Israeli, half American, right? In Israel, I was never quite Israeli. Here, I was never quite American. Going back and forth between the two identities, there's something fundamentally different between the two centers, right? The modes of life between Israel and diaspora Jewry, North American Jewry. In general, it's two different mindsets. They highlight different aspects of our Jewish traditions, and those run counter to each other. And so we've had in the past few years some examples or some issues that have brought it up and made it more prominent in our conversation, right? Whether or not it's it started for me personally. It started with the chief rabbinate not recognizing Rav Avi's letters, and there's a misunderstanding that people say they didn't recognize Rav Avi's conversions. It had nothing to do with conversions. When folks get married in Israel, if they're not from Israel, they have to supply evidence to their marital status, so they're single, and that they're part of the Jewish community. And so Rav Avi's letters was just that. Like, these people daven in my shul, and they're single. And the chief rabbi wouldn't even accept that. And I got involved there with Rav Avi. I was in the sidelines. I tried to support the way I can. I started seeing this, and then Rav Avi is one thing. I mean, it wasn't one thing. It's easier to point fingers because he's on the liberal side. Rav Lukstein was next, and you can see where this is going. This kind of trying to coerce or force Jewish life outside of Israel to conform to the chief rabbinate, something that kind of revitalized this break, this fissure. And then we saw that later with the Kotel crisis. We see it continue, obviously, always there, and what's happening, the lack of solution, lack of peace movement towards peace treaty with the Palestinians, and it continues festering. I think that ultimately, though, all this comes down to the question of this tendency, which people write dissertations and whole books about this, but trying to substitute Israeliness with Jewish identity. And so what happens with folks who are born into a reality where Israel they take Israel for granted, right? Which is fine. I do too as an Israeli, right? Like, I've lived through some wars in Israel, but none of them were like threatening to the existence of Israel as much as folks remember the Six-Day War, Yom Kippur, and those remember the Holocaust, obviously. 70 years later, people are like, okay, Israel's a given, it's a fact, right? And so then the question becomes, so what's next for us? And if we try to substitute Israeliness for Jewish identity, right, then people are saying, wait a second, Israel doesn't recognize my Jewish identity. Israel runs counter to a lot of the values and ideals that I believe in, and therefore I'm not willing to substitute my current identity with that. And then it creates another clash. That's from here. And in Israel, Israelis don't know anything about diaspora Jewry. That's the sad truth, because we're not taught about it. We don't encounter it. We don't think about it. It's kind of there in the background, but it's not something that we deal with every day. So the interventions that are necessary for each side are different.
Right. Fascinating. Okay. Well, lots more to say on that. But let's talk about some of the solutions. I mean, what do you think at large are things that should be done, and what are some things you're doing?
So it's great. I think, first of all, there's a lot of wonderful things that are already happening on the ground. I think most of what we're seeing, though, interestingly, is in Israel, which I think is like a subset of the current paradigm or structure that we're seeing is feeding that, right? Because basically what we're seeing here is, if only Israel would fix its problems, then American Jewry would feel better and more connected. And that's true, but it's not the only thing that's true, right? And there's other components to it. And so so like, for example, myself, when I went to the rabbinate, right, this whole quest, this whole journey was so that I could be part of the change of the chief rabbinate in Israel. Never in my mind did I think that I was doing it because of what American Jewry had to say about the religious reality in Israel. Didn't cross my mind. Even though I care about American Jewry, my family's here, right? It was because Israel needs to fix its own problems for its own sake, right? And so what we're seeing is a lot of work there here on our side of the things. I think what we need to do is refocus the conversation on a stronger Jewish identity, or a deeper Jewish identity that goes beyond Israeliness, that digs deeper, because Israel's part of that identity, but we can't substitute it. And so that's the work that we have to do here, this heightened sense of pride in this Jewish identity, I think, is in the deeper one.
And so just lastly, Tachlis, what does that look like for you? Like,
for sure.
What's the Z3 project doing?
So the Z3 project is, what we do is we've had now, for the past 5 years, we've had conferences in Palo Alto. We've attracted the best and the brightest speakers to come and address our community, our local community. We've had Jeffrey Goldberg come. We've had Israelis and Americans, everybody. We had David Brooks last year. This year we have Tzipi Livni coming. We have Ruth Gavizon coming. Ritz Greenberg is coming. Danny Gordis, the Hartman. Everybody's coming to show up. It's a communal demonstration of the support of this relationship. We have Israelis and Americans come to talk about the difficult issues. Not to resolve them necessarily, but to have a meaningful conversation, hold multiple truths, stay one, and really create this vision of that we're in this together. That's what we're up to.
Great. Keep up your amazing work.
Thank you.